Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar for primary school leaders designed to help prepare for effective remote learning. My name is Dominic. I'm the COO at United Learning. I began my career as a Year 5 teacher some point back in the last century, and ever since then I've been in school leadership roles and technology roles that brought me to where I am now, where over the spring I spent several hours each day supporting multiple schools in trying to deliver effective remote learning during the pandemic. And that's the perspective from which I'm going to be speaking about today. I'm also joined by my colleague, Michelle, who's going to bring her own perspective of school leadership during that period. Michelle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Michelle Green. I'm Executive Principal of Corngreaves and Timotry Academy, and more recently Hamdingle, which is in the West Midlands. This is my third executive headship, and before that I was a head teacher of a successful school and a teaching school alliance, so being heavily involved in school support and action research for quite a while now. So I'm going to talk to you about our journey moving our very successful classroom pedagogy from the classroom to home learning.
Thank you, Michelle. And before we dive into the content that I'll be talking about, just a couple of housekeeping things. So firstly, Michelle and I will be referring to a bunch of resources and links to things, all of which are gathered together on the website that goes along with this webinar. The web address will be up on the final slide, so you can access all of those things. I'm sure some of which you'll find helpful. Secondly, you'll notice that there's a question and answer facility built into this webinar on the top right hand side of your screen. And there's a message there from my colleague Anna, who's going to be reviewing all the questions as they come through. As you'll appreciate, with several hundred people on the call, if every question were published, it would very quickly become overwhelming even to keep up with reading them. So those questions will be asked of us at the end of the webinar. We'll try and answer them verbally, the ones that you have voted for as being ones you want to see answers to. I'm told there are already a couple of questions about whether this will be recorded and made immediately available afterwards. The answer to which is yes, it's being recorded, and it will be made available as quickly as we're able to turn that around when it's finished. And it'll be up, sorry, the recording will be up on the same website. And the final thing to say is that what we're trying to articulate in this webinar is that the experience that Michelle and I have had as school leaders in United Learning. This isn't endorsed by DFE as being the way to do things. There is no way of doing things. This is just what we experienced as being quite successful for us. The things that we're going to talk about might not work in your context. Nothing works everywhere and everything works somewhere. So don't just, not that anyone would, I think, but just adopt wholesale some of the things we're saying. Obviously, it's highly contextually specific. And the aim really is for us to share within this network of schools in England some of the things that have been proven to work. So I'm going to move on to speak about some of the things that I learned in the spring. The first thing to say is that United Learning is an incredibly diverse place in terms of the makeup of its schools. There are over 85 schools within the group in England, and they vary from the smallest one-form entry primary school through to kind of inner city secondary schools and university technical colleges, and all through schools as well that handle education really all the way down from the early years up into A-level. And across that diversity of schools, we saw in the spring what, as you'd expect, a big diversity of preparedness to deliver remote education. And I think in general, it's fair to say that in primary schools where the budgets are smaller, there are fewer people, there's rarely a devoted IT resource, they found the challenge harder. They needed more support than the secondary schools. But the interesting thing that I noted was that actually the support that most of our primary schools needed to go from nowhere to really somewhere that was quite impressive was directional with a bit of training. So being pointed at the kind of resources and the methods. And after that, really, that kind of unlocked a huge amount of of teaching and learning expertise that people very quickly applied to a technology focus, which you'll hear Michelle talk about. That enormous variance between the sectors should have surprised no one. Another kind of insight, though, that I did get is that because we have almost uniquely 14 independent fee-paying schools within the group, I was able to see the very, very stark difference between what the maintained and the independent sectors were able to do. Now, those independent schools have spent the last kind of 5 to 10 years developing quite detailed digital strategies by which saw every child given a device, generally some kind of tablet device. Every teacher equally would have the same device, and they've spent years integrating that into their practice, so that in a very kind of unflashy and unremarkable way, most face-to-face lessons make effective use of technology. The net impact of this was that they didn't really break stride when they had to close or partially close. In fact, one of our head teachers believes that her pupils made more progress during lockdown than they would in a normal year. So if they hadn't been in lockdown, because they didn't have anything to distract them from their schoolwork. Now that, to me, is the reason why every school in England really needs to focus now on ensuring that its remote education is highly effective. I think we all know as school leaders that many children have suffered through school closures. They haven't made the progress that they need to be making. Some have fallen further behind their peers, and those effects will likely follow them around for life. We also know, I think, that we can expect ongoing disruption for the next at least several months, that some children will be out of school for that period. And at times it might even be that due to local lockdowns, some schools might need to almost close entirely. That's not impossible. So if we are to avoid harm and make sure that everyone has an equal chance at life, then really we do need to get this right as a system. So that's hopefully one of the outcomes of this kind of webinar, is to give people some ideas and some guidance, to help you improve and enhance what you're already doing. So we did design a digital strategy. That was mostly the work of myself and a few colleagues at the centre to come up with something that we thought would work everywhere within our group. I can honestly say I haven't worked that hard since I taught Year 6, which was a while ago, but it was an incredibly intense period, mostly because it was fraught with challenges. The first one being we were very alive to the real threat that no matter what we designed and implemented at school level, there'd be plenty of children who just couldn't access it because they didn't have adequate technology. Staff workload was something we knew we couldn't add to if we wanted this to succeed. So the strategy had to work with what teachers were capable of doing, particularly in an unsupported way from home. That tied in quite closely with the skills and confidence that they felt. We really wanted to be kind of pushing an open door with that, and I'll talk a bit about that in a second. Teachers were very anxious about their loss of visibility, really, of some of the children they were most concerned about day to day in their classrooms. So we had to build into this strategy strong ways of allowing teachers to carry on doing the safeguarding work that they're used to doing. And equally, we didn't want to create any professional risk for them by allowing them to contact parents and pupils. And finally, as things progressed, it became really clear that in order for this to work, we had to have a really good grasp of engagement. Which children were actually accessing the learning and were doing the work became a central part of our strategy. So what did we do, and what proved to be the most effective? Well, we put in place what we called our continuity of learning strategy, which built of these 3 parts you see in this jigsaw diagram. The document that explains this in quite a lot of detail is on the website, and I do encourage you to take a look at that at the end. So the 3 strands here are, the first one on the left, the top left, is effective workflows. So making sure that teachers could issue tasks, pupils could see them, they could do the work, submit their work, people could talk about it. It's critical to get that bit right. On the right hand side, another aspect of the work was allowing teachers to easily make support materials, which might be short videos or might be live lessons, but there had to be a strategy to mean that teaching in some respect could carry on. And finally, at the bottom, that there was a way for people to have that daily pastoral and social contact that is such a huge part of school that was suddenly had been ripped away really by people being confined to their homes. So the guiding principle that this must be accessible that I hinted at earlier was really underlay everything. We knew that some of our children had very limited access to technology. You know, that possibly all we could expect is that they might be able to use a parent's mobile phone for 10, 20 minutes a day. So we needed to make sure that whatever we did, the learning could happen at the lowest possible level, could happen via that device. To that end, the main tool that we decided to make use of was something called Microsoft Sway. This is a somewhat kind of underutilized and not particularly well-known part of Office 365. It's hard to describe really, but it allows teachers to very easily, just by dragging and dropping different content, to make a web page, essentially, something that we published on the internet. And a web page that works really well on a computer, but also reorganizes itself so it looks really good and is readable on a phone as well. So that ticked the two kind of boxes around accessibility from a staff point of view, so it didn't require huge amounts of extra skill, and we knew it could be accessed by virtually any of the pupils. It's really quite a powerful technology as well. So obviously you can see from this screenshot here, you know, teachers were, by Easter, were setting daily sways for their classes that contain text of here's what I'd like you to do, which is, you know, that's helpful. But the fact that they could also add in very easily, just by gathering up 4 pictures and writing 4 words, kind of these kind of flashcard activities, asking pupils to identify angles here before checking their answers. As their skills and confidence increased, increasingly we saw teachers videoing either themselves, and Michelle will talk about a few really good examples of these, or more commonly using a visualizer or even some kind of innovatively rigged up iPhone or something to record them demonstrating a method. So the actual active teaching, which could then be, you know, this might be a 2-minute clip, but very easily dropped into the Sway, accessed in a sequential way by the pupil in the way that the teacher wanted them to, and as I say, viewable on anything. And then finally, we increasingly made use of low stakes quizzing at the end of these Sways as well, both as just an effective method of education, but equally as a kind of window on engagement as well, so that teachers start to get visibility of who had done what in the lesson and then start making appropriate calls home for children who weren't accessing it. Building on that, as things, again, as people became more and more confident, one of the things that we'd been using at secondary became quite prevalent, and that was what we called voice-over PowerPoints. So where teachers would take a PowerPoint that they have used for teaching before and basically teach, but record that teaching. So this would be maybe just your voice, if that's what you felt confident doing, but also maybe your picture windowed in the bottom corner, as you can see me now. And the teacher would record that. They might do the kind of 15 minutes of input, and that would, at the end of that process, you press a button in PowerPoint, it makes a video. You can embed that in your Sway, and it's what was referred to at the time as an asynchronous learning, so something you previously recorded and then issued. And then towards the end of lockdown, people began to explore live teaching and actually having lessons which didn't look like traditional lessons, but where children were actually present at the same time as the teacher. So that was our strategy. We realised that it was only as good as it was perceived to be by pupils, staff and parents. So we made sure that we asked them how it was going. We wrote, from the centre, we wrote what we called pulse surveys. So surveys designed to very quickly judge what's going on. And we issued them in May, June and July. And at a school level, schools were then able to respond quite quickly if parents were saying something wasn't effective, or they didn't appreciate something, or they needed more support in a certain area. And at a group level, we could look at trends and adjust our strategy and support schools to do things slightly differently as well. So that was a really important part of what we did. As I mentioned, many children had very limited access to technology. So we ordered a number of Chromebooks and a number of 4G Wi-Fi devices, so that's that little white box there. The idea being you could put this in a child's home and it would use the cellular network to provide internet in their house. As it turned out, we didn't actually need as many of those. Our suspicion had been that many children wouldn't have good broadband, and that just didn't prove to be the case. Many families already had that good provision. What they didn't have was a dedicated device for learning, which is why we made use of Chromebooks. I've talked a lot about Microsoft products so far, but the Chromebook was our solution here because it's cheap, it's safe, you can lock it down completely. It's really easy to manage over the internet, so schools could decide who had access to it and who didn't. It's got very low resale value because if it's tied to your school network, no one else can use it. For all these reasons, they proved highly effective. And as we moved closer towards live teaching, particularly where there are siblings in the school as well, we do need children to have their own device because sharing doesn't really work. Something I haven't mentioned yet, but should, is that we also put in place a soft phone solution, meaning that teachers had a piece of software that they could use to make phone calls. That was great because it meant they didn't have to use their own phones and things like that, didn't have to share their phone, and there's no danger of their phone number being known to parents, things like this. But crucially, it allowed teachers from multiple places, so isolating teachers in their own homes to join the same phone call. So that made these safeguarding conversations really easy as well and without risk. And the last thing I'll say on this slide is that there's a slightly strange concept that's been hanging around for as long as I've been involved in technology, that effective teaching and learning is somehow separate from effective use of technology. And those two things are approached in different ways, when actually the only thing that we should all be trying to do as educators is to take what we already know about what effective teaching and learning is and think of ways in which technology can deliver those things. So at United Learning, we've been focused on the Rosenshine principles for the last couple of years. Things like, these are simple ideas that have been proven to work, such as starting each lesson with a review of prior learning. Equally, there are some really good educationalists thinking through now, perhaps sometimes for the first time because they've never had to use technology before, but how you can deliver well-proven and researched techniques through technology. And there's some links on the website to some of their thinking. I encourage you to read particularly Daniel Williams' piece on this. If you're not sure where to start, though, a great place is the Education Endowment Foundation's report from last year, using digital technology to improve learning. It really does take this focus, which is to start from the point of what do we know that works? And then the second question, how can technology deliver those things? So as I said, I've talked a fair amount about what we've done. If you forget all of our particular solutions, I'm just going to illustrate quite quickly what the building blocks are, the functionalities that I think any effective digital strategy needs to have, regardless of the bits that you use to build that. So the first thing being what's often referred to as a workflow. So this is what I'd call the glue, the wrapper, the thing that connects everything together, the way in which you can issue tasks and lessons and pupils can see those and their parents can see those, pupils can do the work, they can communicate with each other and with you about them. We use Microsoft Teams for that. Another solution that's very popular is Google Classroom. The key thing being that it's one system, everyone understands it, and it's tied into your methods of authentication. It's safe. The only people who can get in are the people who go to your school, the staff and the pupils. Within that workflow, you want an equally safe way of sharing video. Again, we're using Microsoft Teams today. We didn't begin in lockdown using Teams. We used Skype to begin with, or Skype for Business, because it had better safeguarding features. But other providers have now caught up, and this is a really effective way of sharing video because it's so controllable. I can, turn off people's cameras, mute them, all of those things that you need for teaching. Content is obviously vital. I've talked a lot about what we did. We created sways and PowerPoints. United Learning Schools benefited from the fact that we've, for the past 2 years, been developing the United Learning curriculum. Central subject advisors and people in schools have been writing lesson plans and creating resources, and we put all that on a website. So that's something that our schools made heavy use of. They also made heavy use of the Oak Academy materials, which I'm sure you've all used as well. And that's a fantastic resource for the country now to have access to. But yes, obviously as part of your solution, you need content, and we'll talk more about kind of plugging some of those gaps in a sec. Perhaps dully, but very importantly, this is a kind of facilitating factor here. You should, if you haven't already, be making the move to some kind of cloud storage for your documents. We use Office 365, Google's G Suite is another popular solution. When you have your documents in the cloud, that means they're no longer in a cupboard in a server, on a server in the school, and relatively hard to access from home, sometimes impossible to access from home. They're freely shareable. Not only can you share them, you can comment on them, so you can easily use them as collaborative tools. Now, we spent a couple of years helping our schools make that transition just in time. It wasn't planned, we didn't see this coming, but it did put them in a position to be easily able to pivot to effective remote learning in the spring. There is, I should say, DFE funded support for this, and the link to that is on the website too. So if you haven't yet moved across to Office or G Suite, then you should consider doing so, and you should access that funding support. And the last piece is, in an effective digital strategy, one of the building blocks is our metrics of knowing who is doing what, which child is turning up, basically, because your metrics become a proxy for attendance. Who is turning up? How long are they spending? What are they doing? Do you need to intervene? In an ideal world, all of this would be automatically generated by your management information system, so it would know who's in which class. Particularly important if you teach several things, not that common across in primary schools, but if you are teaching maths, let's say in 3-year groups, you don't really want to be keeping up to date with 3 different class sets. You want your MIS to be doing the heavy lifting there. So finally from me, before I hand over to Michelle, what can schools do now to prepare for further disruption? So what are the things we can be thinking about right now, even if we feel we're in quite a good position? So DFE has set out its expectations here. It wants every school to be able to deliver a coherent curriculum, both face-to-face and to isolating children. And it wants every school to have the capacity for immediate remote education, should that be required. Now, that's easier said than done. And a lot of that is about the logistics rather than the technology. So the first thing I'd say is I'd emphasise the need to, if you have yet to do this, seek feedback. Ask parents and ask pupils what worked and what didn't work. Learn from that and respond as needed. This is definitely the time to think about how you can deliver education to isolating pupils without creating additional workload. I'm certain that teachers cannot sustainably teach all day face-to-face and then prepare things for the 2 or 3 children who can't be there for the next day. So finding ways in which those pupils who aren't in school can still participate in the taught lessons, can hear those lessons, can do work related to them without creating additional workload is essential. This is partly a technical problem, but it's only a minor technical problem, really. Much more important are the kind of safeguarding things to think through. We've got some advice on this that we're helping our schools to use. That's up on the website too. Definitely worth looking at. It is sensible now to start thinking about the sequencing of your curriculum. Are there things that can be sensibly deferred until a time when the prevalence of the virus may be lower? Are there things that you can deliver that you can't yet deliver through a digital method? I mean, all schools have or almost all schools have some kind of maths delivery solution. Very few have one for science, for example. Are there gaps you can plug? If you are introducing new technology, and I have to emphasise that it's easier to start with what you know, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't innovate as well, then now's the time to integrate that into face-to-face practice. So use it in the lessons, get people familiar with it, communicate it to parents, give staff and pupils the training they need. This is particularly important if you're going to be using some kind of workflow. Remember, to do that safely, people effectively need to be logged in. That's probably easily possible at the top end of Key Stage 2, but the younger you get, the more training and familiarisation children are going to need. You're probably going to have to do some support of parents as well in this. And finally, the kind of hardware consideration. Are there things that you can keep a stock of? If you're lucky enough to have enough devices, can you keep them ready to go out instantly? Equally for teachers as well, Have you got a plan for getting a visualizer from the classroom to an isolating teacher's house? Because that might double their effectiveness if they're isolating for 2 weeks, but still remotely teaching in some way. We were quite surprised that over 1,000 of our employees out of 8,000 requested to use their own device during lockdown because they didn't have a school issued device. We didn't think the problem was that widespread, but 1,000 people wanted that. Have you thought through how people could safely use their own device without creating GDPR problems, etc.? And again, as you're a guest, there's a document on the website that you might find helpful describing our approach. So that's definitely enough from me. I'm going to hand over now to Michelle, and she's going to talk to you about what she experienced.
Thank you, Dominic. I think at this point, the first thing for me to say is right at the very beginning of the journey, we were a school that had zero expertise, zero provision, and zero confidence in terms of delivering online learning in any format. So where did the journey all start? Well, I can, like most of you, I can tell you it began on Friday the 13th. So a week before schools actually went into lockdown, I started thinking to myself, at some point we have got to move our classroom practice to home learning. How are we going to do that with what we've currently got, which is very, very little in place? And the starting point for me was where are we in terms of our curriculum, our core curriculum? Where are we up to? What needs to be taught next? And when we started to think about it, our core curriculum, we were coming to the end of that term's learning. So we're in an ideal position at this point to provide home learning, which was basically just revisiting and reviewing learning which had already taken place. So that's where we started. Obviously, that has issues. We had no online learning platforms at all and no digital strategy for any online learning platform. So it was really difficult for us to move to any form of online learning right at the very beginning of the journey. And to follow up, we had no idea of how many pupils actually had devices and appropriate devices which they could use to access any online site. I think more importantly to say at this point, we weren't aware of how many of our adults didn't actually have access to their own device to be able to build and prepare online learning. So I think it's really important to make sure you've done an audit of your staff to make sure you know who does and who doesn't have the devices which will enable them to do what we need them to do. Some staff had laptops, but they weren't fast enough to be able to upload video. So at that, when we realised that was an issue, the very first thing we did was buy all staff new laptops to be able to deliver the online learning. So we had absolutely no experienced staff, and I thought to myself, goodness me, this is a massive job we've got to do. So the very first thing I did was I had researched for any available platforms which were out there which would get us through to the Easter holiday. So for us, that was 2 weeks away. I discovered an online platform called Study Ladder, which I looked at it and it had some very sensible content in relation to the national curriculum, particularly for science, maths and grammar. So what I did at that point is I released all the staff to say, please go and have a look at this content and then plan out 2 weeks worth of lessons for your pupils in your class, covering what you've already covered, so that A, they will be able to access it easily, and B, there'll be no requirement for parents to support them, because at this particular time we didn't know whether or not the parents, how easy they'd find that. But then this caused a few issues in terms of, well, it doesn't cover reading, and what's that going to look like now we're at home and we can't be sending weekly home readers. So we had a look around for other things and we found something called Read Theory, which we also signed up to. So it did mean that children were going home with several different passwords to be able to access these different sites. So that in terms of the core curriculum offer, we managed to make sure that we'd got an online offer in place. But in terms of the other areas, foundation subjects, we were very keen to make sure that gaps in knowledge didn't occur. One of my schools had recently had an officer inspection, and how important it is to make sure that the curriculum is correctly sequenced and children don't develop gaps in knowledge. We were very mindful of this at the time. So we're a school that has in place a research booklet approach to history and geography. So we were able to send those home. Those booklets are taught in small steps, follow the Rosenstein principles, and each activity is in there. So we had a core blended offer in place. We had some online learning and some booklets and paper-based activities for the 2 weeks prior to the Easter holiday. Of course, the issue with this was, when you're all going to ask, is EYFS, what did this look like for children in early years? That was a bit of a headache for us all. To start off with, we sent our children in early years home with paper-based activities, and this was generally around overlearning activities in terms of letter formation, number formation, sight vocabulary. It was all of those things that they'd be sent home on a weekly basis, but we weren't able to offer any online provision for children in early years. The issue with some of the things that we had got in place, of course, there was no feedback loop and there was no direct instruction, and definitely no direct learning taking place. However, the feedback from parents at this time was they really enjoyed the study ladder. It's a system which generates certificates and rewards for pupils as and when they complete activities. And of course, there was no onus on the parent to provide any support. So for the first 2 weeks, the parents were really not involved in the online learning at all. Thank you. Can I have the next slide, please? So where did we move on from this? So as things became more apparent that we would be in lockdown for much longer than first anticipated, we really started to think about, okay, so what is important to us as a school? We have spent such a long time making sure that our pedagogy and practices are excellent, that we don't want to lose any of this. We don't want to lose learning behaviours, we don't want to lose pace, and we want to make sure that children are still practicing some of those things that are really important. So we thought, what does our core offer need to look like in the summer term moving forward? We can't be relying on just signposting parents to different sites. We want something in place whereby it is new learning and they will be getting exactly the same offer, which would mirror that in the classroom. So for us, daily deliberate practice and automaticity is really, really important. So we wanted to hold tight to all of those things that we do in terms of making sure that we enable children to become fluent. And then we thought really long and hard about those daily lessons that were going to be important. Reading, maths, writing and GPS. As you can see there, we had a worry about writing. What does writing look like if you're delivering online? And how do you give that feedback? Because at this moment in time, we weren't in a position where we got anything to enable us to do that. We were really concerned about writing stamina and how do we make sure that we keep that? And again, early years, we were really concerned about what provision looked like for early years. My early years leader was very passionate for it to look like it would in the classroom. She said, how am I going to achieve this? And we spent a lot of time thinking about this. What we thought was really important is that her children got to see her face, to bring together that class family feel and the school family feel. We thought it was important that children got to see their teachers' faces. Now, in terms of making sure that the curriculum offer matched that in the classroom, that would look like in the summer term, we stuck with history, geography, science and music. And this became our core offer. This is what we were going to provide for our children in the summer term. How we were going to do it was a different matter. We hadn't got that sorted, but we had definitely sorted what it was we were going to be delivering. Really importantly for us, we absolutely didn't want the gap to widen between our disadvantaged and our non-disadvantaged. So we thought long and hard about how we're going to make sure this happens. And at some point in the process, we were provided with Chromebooks from the Trust. So that really helped for that. And where we were not able to contact children to give them Chromebooks, we made sure that we got them into school face to face so that the gap didn't start to widen. Can I have the next slide, please? And then came an expectation from the Trust, which was music to my ears, because the Trust produced their continuity of learning strategy, which identified all of these areas. It needed to be meaningful. So a clear learning journey across a unit of work, definitely not signposting parents to different sites. It needed to build on prior learning. So again, it was about embedding those Rose and Shine principles, everything that we hold tight to in our classrooms and in our lesson delivery. Review and recall, so we build on previous learning. Scaffolding small steps. There was an expectation that delivery would be teachers actually doing the direct instruction, the teaching and modelling in small steps. So teachers, there was an expectation that they would video themselves or do the PowerPoint voiceover, but the pupils at home would be seeing their teachers providing the modelling and demonstrating. And then, of course, after that, there's the expectation for independent practice. We enabled this to happen because we provided all children with exercise books as well. We were very key to make sure that handwriting presentation didn't slip, so that we gave them we replicated the book offer that they would have in school to write in. And then through the use of the sway, there was the expectation for feedback to check for understanding. And at this point, when we put this into place, we saw engagement rise, really increase. And of course, what was more importantly, it needed to have minimal support from home and very few clicks to access it. So it needed to be easily accessible. But the one thing that I was really keen that this facilitated was it meant that teachers were still teaching, because I've read things during lockdown where after lockdown, when we've gone back to school, when teachers have said things like, oh, I'm so rusty, I've forgotten how to teach. But actually using this model, it meant that teachers were still teaching and they were still thinking about the process and the planning process and teaching for children's next steps. So the expectation from the Trust made sure that we were covering all of this. Okay, next slide, please. So what did this look like for us? The Sway a Day. There was a lot of training involved in making sure that teachers were up to scratch with the technology and the software and how to use Sway. It's a very, very simple and easy package. It's a click and drop. And like Dominic's already mentioned, you can actually operate it on a phone if that's the only device you've got. So there was an expectation from the Trust that this would be the timetable across the week. We expanded on this slightly because we wanted to make sure that we'd got a clear journey for reading and a clear journey for writing. So we split English. Feedback from parents that we were getting through the pulse surveys was that actually there is a lot of work to get through. And towards the end of the day, the engagement's dropping off and the stamina is dropping off. And of course, it was difficult at times because there were pupils sharing devices with siblings in the house. So our advice was do what you can do and just try to do as much as possible. So in terms of what that looked like lesson by lesson delivery, the expectation was set with staff that the Sway would start with prior learning. And there's a great piece of software called Stacks in there, and it actually is like using flashcards. So you just click on the flashcard, you can have questions, you can have choral rehearsal of phonics, times tables, number bonds. That's a great way of doing deliberate practice. Then following that, there would be the direct instruction with the new learning, but also sharing of learning objectives as well. So we weren't losing the language of learning from teachers or pupils. Then we would move into guided practice. Then we would move into independent practice, where the expectations were children would record this in books. And then at the end of the lesson, there would be a form which each pupil would need to fill in. And then that's to check for understanding. It would have a few questions related to the learning, and then that would get emailed back to the class teacher with their name on it, so that they would be able to check the levels of understanding for each pupil by pupil. But more importantly, what this enabled us to do, the Sway a Day, was to have an introduction from the teacher, a video introduction, so that we didn't lose that class family feel. The EYFS Sway, which is on the website, so please do have a look at that. That was the class teacher there did take the register every day and said good morning to every pupil at the start of the daily sway. So that really kept the class feel and the connectedness there. Following this, what happened after this, how we took it the next stage further, the feedback from parents was they're struggling with the maths content and we really need more direct instruction around the maths. So we took it one step further onto live lessons. Through the use of Teams, we decided that we would do one daily live lesson, and that at that point all the pupils were actively engaged in those lessons and signed up, and that had a huge impact with the engagement going further forward, because they knew at some point throughout the week there would be a live lesson and they would get to see all their class family. So next slide please. So going forward, what my advice to you in terms of if you're moving in this direction, have a clear continuity of learning plan in place, a tiered approach. So you're going to have some children who are going to be self-isolating for a few days while they're waiting for test results. You're going to have some that are on a 2-week complete and utter self-isolation. So have a tiered approach in terms of your learning, but also in terms of staff. The chances are you might have 2 members of staff that need to self-isolate for 2 weeks. How can you, if they're well, how can you ensure that they can still do live learning to the children back in the classroom? Staff training and resources, make sure that they've got the technology and the training to be able to move to this. And I would invest some time in the Sway technology if you think this will be useful to your setting. Online learning offer matches that in the school of the curriculum. So have a little think about your curriculum and your offer, and can you make sure that your online learning matches that? Live lessons. The one thing we did learn from this was the timetabling of live lessons. Try where possible to avoid clashes, so that if there's only one device in the household, and I'm a child in year 1, but I've also got a sibling in year 3, that they're not timetabled at the same time. To support your online learning and digital strategy, I would investigate having a look at some of the free resources that are out there, especially at the moment. There are lots of companies offering some really good resources. On the other hand, there are lots of companies offering not so good resources, so I'd spend some time having a look at that. I think really the main message to take away from this is I'm not a digital lead. I don't have a great digital experience in terms of background. However, I took the lead on moving the classroom offer to a home learning offer in terms of a blended approach and moving it more onto online. So you don't need to be an expert in the digital area, but I do think that it's really important that you manage to move your school's pedagogy and policies into home learning, so that there is, when children return, they don't feel like they don't know how to do it. And that's the same with teachers as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. So the thing I just pick up on from what you said at the end there, I'm not a digital expert or a digital leader. Well, very plainly you are. You've managed to move 2 schools an incredible distance from being entirely paper-based to begin with to now kind of a real blended approach, including some live teaching. And I spent 2 decades really working in educational technology. For most of the time, the narrative has very much been, teachers aren't very good at technology or they don't want to use it. Why is this? And that's just such a kind of lie, really. Teachers have never really had reason to invest enormously in this. But as soon as they were presented with it being the only option to ensure the best outcomes for their pupils, then they threw themselves at it and rose to the challenge in extraordinary ways. My wife is a teacher and she was teaching from the kitchen table for 4 months and, has never really used technology in anger before. She doesn't keep me around for no reason. Generally, I get to do that stuff. And but she, by the end of it, was, running, she was using Google in her school, but she was running Google calls as confidently as anyone I've ever seen. And it really just was heartening to see. That said, there are lots of schools still facing enormous challenges, particularly around capacity. I think generally speaking, the smaller the school, the steeper this hill looks. So without saying too much more, just to point out the fact that the website that we've been referring to throughout is on the screen now. And now I'm going to ask Anna, if you wouldn't mind picking a few of the most popular questions to put to Michelle or I.
Yes, thank you, Dominic. So starting with the most popular one, and inevitably because of where we've been perhaps over the summer, lots of the sort of sense of that was primarily about what happens where you've got lots of children at home at the same time. But a question about kind of how you are managing, or how we have helped schools to manage the balance between teaching a class in school and also providing learning for pupils who are isolating. I don't know, Michelle, do you want to maybe start with kind of how you're thinking about that in your schools, and then Dominic maybe kind of from a more general point of view?
Yep, so yes, that is really tricky. And I anticipated this would be the issue back in July. So I wrote our continuity of learning plan back in July. And basically what we've done is in the office, there is the history, geography and science booklet for every year group. There are the maths resources for every year group, and there are the reading and writing resources. Should a child say then in 2-week isolation, then that the next 2 weeks gets photocopied and sent home. And if it's the next 2 or 3 days, that gets photocopied and sent home. So it's about being prepared. So we've got all the curriculum in master folders ready to go. And as soon as parents come in and drop in and tell us this is the outcome, then that's what we're moving to. Currently, we're live lessons whilst we are teaching in the classroom and whilst we have got children isolating. That is just a paper-based system at the moment. However, we are, where we've had teachers out, teachers are providing live lessons back to their class or some direct instruction from home while the class is being overseen by a HLTA. So we haven't actually moved children on to online learning at the moment, but we have with teachers.
And then just to comment a little on our group approach to it, is that as I suggested, there are technical ways of making it possible to teach face to face. So you've got 28 children in front of you in the classroom, 2 at home isolating, still able to access that. Our suggested solution, and again this works better the older the children, but is to have a Teams call going on, much like this Teams call, where what you're actually sharing are your slides, the things you'd be teaching with, the things you'd be projecting onto the board. Or so that might be the kind of output from your visualizer that you're sharing, or it might just be the camera pointed at your dry whiteboard. I mean, that works as well. And then with so your teacher doesn't have to be completely tethered, to sit in front of that PC. Some kind of microphone that allows them to teach at the board. So some schools are buying microphones that are draped over the board. Some have got Bluetooth microphones. Some have just got a desk mic, just that's positioned at the edge of the desk, pointing in the right direction. So that enables the teacher to teach face to face, and for that, in reasonable fidelity, to be captured, the audio to be captured, and to go along with the slides, so that children who are at home are watching that lesson take place. You can't see those children. They can't see the class. There's no actual camera pointing at any child. The teacher can control whether their mics are muted or not. All of those things are really important. But the crucial thing being, if you can get that to work in a way that doesn't create additional workload, that doesn't force you into a compromise in what you're doing face to face, and those are big ifs, but I have seen it happening, and I've seen it in some of our schools are doing this, then effectively you have halved the workload. You've got those children accessing the same offer. You're not double planning, you're not creating materials. That would seem to be quite attractive if you can kind of overcome the relatively minor technical hurdles. As I said, there are significant safeguarding hurdles to this, which is why I talk about where the camera needs to be pointing, who's got control over microphones and things like that. And equally, I think as school leaders, if we're concerned about the quality of teaching as well, we need to think quite carefully about piping that into homes too. So obviously the solution to that is, you have high quality teaching, but that is not something that can be affected instantly. So yeah, I think we're all going to learn a bit from this as time goes on. As I said, if an isolating teacher does one thing, then they should, as they leave the classroom, they should pick up their visualizer, and then teaching from home becomes really highly effective. Again, you'll need an adult back in the classroom, a TA at minimum, obviously, a high-level TA, to be able to actually manage the environment. But it should mean, especially for, I think, specialist teachers. So if you have one teacher who delivers across multiple classrooms and you're faced with the prospect of losing them for 2 weeks while they are not unwell but not allowed into school, then a technical solution to allowing it to happen is vital.
Thank you both. Just passing to a different topic on kind of provision for the youngest pupils, and Michelle, you alluded to this early on in your presentation of that being a real challenge, particularly at the beginning. Could you tell people a little bit more about kind of how you developed provision, particularly for EYFS in Key Stage 1?
Yep, so the EYFS sways, all the lessons were videos of the teacher, very small videos in very small steps, singing, rhymes, modelling, phonics, using things that you would find in the house, lots of stuff going on outside in the garden. We had beautiful weather at the time, so that made it easier. This is going to be slightly more tricky now we're in the autumn, but it was stripping it right back, so it and making it very play-based. Lots of the activities were play-based, and it was basically helping and supporting the parents and modelling that to the parents, for the parent to be able to lead the activity back in their house. So that's what the EYFS one looked like. In terms of Key Stage 1, that looked very similar to what I've already described in terms of what the expectation would be in the classroom, in the books. At the start of the journey, we did send home all the necessary scaffolds that we thought children would require in terms of words, maths, spelling cards, letter formation. If they're children with special educational needs, they had a very separate sway linked to their targets, linked to their area of identified needs. So there were speech and language sways that were sent out. EHCP children, theirs looked very different as well. That wasn't the blanket offer for children with additional needs. But I would encourage you to have a little look at the sway on the website. It really is, for those of you that can remember, it really is like watching an episode of Play School.
Thanks, Michelle. And picking up just on that point you were making there about parents, a number of questions coming through about the role of parents, I guess from two particular angles. One from the sort of end of parents expecting something that perhaps you're either not able to or not quite yet ready to provide in terms of level of online teaching, and the other, how engaging parents who are reluctant or unable because of their own workload really to support their children's learning at home, and I guess how you overcame that.
Yep, so that was tricky. That was one of the things we thought about in terms of parents unable to support because they are also working from home. So in terms of the videos, teachers videoing themselves and embedding that into the sway, the one additional benefit you've got there, which you don't have with live lessons, is children can rewatch it and rewind it. So if there are bits they get stuck on, they can go back and watch the teacher's modelling. During live lessons, that's not always possible unless you're filming and recording your teams. And in terms of, we were very mindful that the modelling needed to be very explicit and would not rely on parental engagement and support. However, we did have some feedback from parents who were saying, you know, I'm just struggling with this at the moment in terms of workload and managing my own workload, and I think we've got to be realistic about that. So we did encounter those issues. We tried to overcome that by saying to parents, this is the purpose of the video. It's there so that the children can re-watch it. And then if there was children that were struggling, we would signpost them to other areas of learning or other year groups learning if they were struggling with some content from the previous year group, which prevented them from moving forward. So sorry, what was the first part of your question? I don't think I answered that.
Sorry, I should have broken it up more clearly. It was about whether you had any pressure from parents to do more than you were able to do at kind of particular moments, and how you managed that.
Not at all. If anything, we had the opposite, because parents were saying that there was too much home learning for the children to get through in a day, especially because we split that English into separate reading lessons and writing lessons. They were saying that by the end of the day, the stamina, they just hadn't got the stamina to maintain it. And I also think that that was due to the circumstances which we were all living and operating under. So if anything, we had the opposite, where parents were saying there is too much for them to get through.
Thank you. I think we've probably got time for one or two more questions. So just part from that point about kind of the pressure everybody's been under, how have you supported teachers, thought about their well-being, their workload, and I guess in particular with an eye to those teachers who themselves might have young children at home?
Yeah, this was also something we gave a lot of consideration to. So for the schools that I lead, they're a mile and a half apart in terms of locality. Everything mirrors in each school. They are one form entry primary school, so there is nobody else to share the workload with in terms of teacher in the next door classroom. So how we approached it was that we divvied up the workload. So the year one sway was put together by the 2 year one teachers. So actually I'm not preparing every lesson in that sway a day. I might be preparing 3 out of the 6. So that's what we did in terms of making sure that we were considering workload, but also at the same time, the trust has got subject advisors who are working really hard in the background, producing lots of resources for all of the subjects. So for some instances, it may well have been just a click and drag into the sway. And we know that's a very unique situation because not all schools that aren't part of a trust aren't going to have that level of support in the background. So we were very mindful to use those resources as and when we could along with our curriculum that we were teaching.
Well, I just add to that. Sorry, yeah, just to say that really good joined up systems, particularly our workflow, does reduce workload and stress. If your workflow is email, so every pupil is going to email you work and every parent's going to be in email contact with you, and that's the way in which you're working, you will quickly be, quite rightly, overwhelmed by just the flood of individual things you need to do. If you're able to, in one click, communicate with 30 people, it's massively empowering to make it possible for you to do the things you need to do. The issue being that, as we all know, teachers tend to throw their lives at work. And when in the lockdown, when that became massively more complex, there were people working 16, 17 hours a day, which is obviously unsustainable, but can be ameliorated by getting good technology systems in place and moving away from the slightly more manual and high touch approach to, having to contact every person individually.
Thank you. Just one more final question around safeguarding concerns and whether sort of what we were able to do at trust level and at school level to make sure that all of this was safe for children and for teachers.
Well, I've mentioned the soft phone system that meant, you'd have phone calls to pupils with 2 adults from separate locations. That was quite an important thing to put in place because people really didn't know how they were going to handle that. And they felt that sometimes they did need to speak to an individual pupil, but the parent couldn't be there. Particularly acute at secondary, I think, but not absent at primary at all. We spent a lot of time in the first few weeks ensuring people weren't doing things dangerously with video tools. So keeping people initially off Zoom, because Zoom really wasn't a safe place for teaching and learning to take place in April. And even keeping people off Teams until Teams developed enough to be completely controllable by the teacher, so that children couldn't bully each other in back channels, so that you wouldn't have cameras being used inappropriately, all those kind of things. So I suppose doing your diligence on your key tool is vital. I think Teams and Google Meet are now in a very good, safe place for use by schools.
Thank you. Michelle, sorry.
Yeah, we moved to Teams as soon as it was safe to do so in terms of delivering the live lessons. And we shared with parents the protocol in terms of this is the expectations for children and this is the expectations for adults. There was absolutely no adults allowed to be. First of all, the parent had to join with the child, so we know that the parent had joined, but then they had to remove themselves. And we set some very clear protocols with parents before we launched it, and we did some training with parents themselves on a Teams meeting, just to explain the situation, how it would work.
Thank you very much. I think that's probably all the time for.
I'll have to leave it there. I think the last thing to say is that for anyone who is struggling to know where to begin, it's worth flagging that the Department for Education has something called, the word has temporarily left my brain, sorry, there's a programme of schools who are there in an outreach model where they can, where you can request support and they will get in touch with you and help you in any way they can. That link is on the website, and yeah, take up that if you need more help.
Dominic, I think that there may be some issue with the link that we've published on the slide. People are trying to get through to it but are struggling to access that link. I think it may not have a dash.
I think you're right. I'm not sure how that's crept in. Probably my fault.
So yeah, just for those who are trying to use that link, if you use the link as it is, but remove the dash between primary and leadership, you should be able to access the materials.
Thank you very much, everyone.